Orc refused to lie under oath. Her honesty freed an innocent human and changed the law. I need no one can know I am here. The words came from the darkness beneath the old grain mill, where an orc woman pressed herself against the stone foundation. Blood seeped through the leather wrapping on her shoulder, and her breathing came shallow and pained. She had been there since dawn, hiding from something or someone. Garrett, returning from checking his fishing nets, heard the labored breathing and crept closer. He saw her size first, then the glint of metal at her hip, a sword far too ornate for a common traveler. Despite every instinct screaming at him to run, he knelt and offered his water skin. She took it with a hand that trembled, though her eyes remained fierce. On her finger, half hidden by dirt and blood, a heavy ring caught the morning light. Its symbol meant nothing to him. He did not know he had just helped the chief magistrate of the northern orc clans, the one who would soon hold his life in her hands. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. And if you have an idea for our next orc-bound tale, your ideas could become our next story. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Garrett's life depends on her truth. The cottage sat where the river bent east, a squat structure of weathered wood and patch thatch that leaked when the rains came hard. Garrett had lived there alone for 3 years, ever since the border raids had taken his wife and infant daughter. The place still smelled of river water and old smoke, and the floorboards creaked in the night like they were remembering voices that would never come back. He was 32, but looked older, with callous hands from mending nets, and a lean frame that spoke of meals skipped more often than eaten. The villagers 2 miles upper tolerated him, but kept their distance. He'd chosen isolation after the funerals, and they'd let him have it. That morning, mist clung to the water, like it couldn't decide whether to stay or drift away. Garrett checked his nets before dawn, pulling up 3 small perch and a river carp. Not much, but enough. He was walking back when he heard the breathing. It came from beneath the old mill foundation, where stone met earth in a dark hollow. The sound was wrong, too labored, too pained. Garrett approached slowly, his fishing knife loose in his belt, though he'd never used it on anything but fish and rope. She was massive, even crouched and wounded. She was easily a head taller than him, with shoulders that could carry a plow ox. Her skin was gray, green in the dim light, and her hair, black as river stones, was matted with sweat and dirt. The leather wrapping on her shoulder was soaked through with blood. Her eyes found his. They were amber-sharp despite the pain, and they assessed him in a single sweep. Predator's eyes even weakened. Garrett should have run. Every story he'd ever heard said orcs were dangerous, violent, never be trusted. But he'd also heard stories about a lot of things, and life had taught him that most stories were only half true. He knelt and offered his water skin. She stared at it, then at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Her hand trembled when she reached for it, and he saw the ring, then heavy silver, engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. It sat on her, middle finger, half hidden by dried blood. She drank deeply water, running down her chin. When she finished, she handed it back with a careful precision that suggested she was used to formality even now. He asked if she could walk. She said she thought so, but her voice carried doubt. He glanced around. The village was far enough, but if anyone came down river this way, they'd see her, and that would mean trouble for them both. He told her his cottage wasn't far. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Deceit, maybe? Ulterior motive. When she didn't find it, she nodded once. Getting her there took 20 minutes. That felt like an hour. She leaned on him more than her pride probably wanted, and he felt the heat of fever radiating from her skin. By the time they reached his door, she was barely conscious. He got her inside and onto his bed, the only bed, and began to work. The wound was deep, a blade thrust that had missed anything vital, but had bled too much for too long. He cleaned it with boiled water and the last of his honey, then wrapped it with strips torn from his spare shirt. She woke once while he worked, her hand snapping to his wrist with shocking strength. Her eyes were unfocused but fierce, and she said something in a language he didn't understand. He told her gently that he was helping, that she was safe. She searched his face again, then released him and drifted back under. When he was finished, Garrett sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and watched her sleep. She was unlike anyone he'd ever seen, powerful even in weakness, graceful even in pain. Her breathing had evened out, and color was slowly returning to her skin. On the small table by the window, her sword rested where he'd placed it. The hilt was wrapped in worn leather, but the pommel was silver inlaid with what looked like jade. No traveler carried a weapon like that. No common soldier either. He wondered who she was running from. He wondered if they'd come looking. Outside, the river flowed on, indifferent to the impossible thing happening in the cottage beside it. Garrett hadn't always been alone. Once he'd had a wife named Era, who laughed like music, and a daughter named Mira, who just learned to walk. They'd lived in the village proper, then in a small house near the market square. He'd worked as an assistant to the village magistrate, keeping records and witnessing contracts. It was humble work, but honest. Then the raids came. The border had always been tense. All clans on one side, human settlements on the other, and too much history between them. When the fighting broke out, it was swift and brutal. Garrett had been in the fields when it happened. By the time he got back, his house was burning and his family was gone. The magistrate told him the orcs had done it. The survivors told him the orcs had done it. The soldiers who arrived too late said the orcs had done it. And Garrett, drowning in grief, had believed them. But then he'd found the weapons left behind. Human weapons, human boot prints in the ash. And when he tried to bring this to the magistrate, he'd been told to let it go, that some truths were dangerous, that the peace was fragile enough without accusations. So Garrett had left. He'd taken his grief and his anger and his terrible suspicion that his family had died not in a raid, but in something far worse, a false flag maybe, or simple banditry blamed on convenient enemies. He'd built his cottage by the river and learned to live with not knowing. But he'd also learned something else, that kindness mattered more than certainty, and that leaving someone to die because of what they were was no better than murder. That's why he'd helped the orc woman. Not because he was brave, because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. The orc woman's name was Sarah, though Garrett didn't know that yet. She was 32 years old and had served as chief magistrate of the northern orc clans for 7 years. Her mother had held a position before her, and her grandmother before that. The role was not inherited, but earned 3 years of studying clan law, 5 years apprenticeship under the sitting magistrate, and then a trial before the High Council, where candidates had to demonstrate not just knowledge, but wisdom. The Zara had passed with the highest marks in a generation. Her position made her powerful. She presided over disputes between clans, witnessed treaties, and served as final arbiter in cases where clan law was unclear. Her word carried the weight of tradition, and her judgment was considered absolute. It also made her dangerous to those who wanted to bend the law. She'd been investigating rumors of corruption, clan elders taking bribes to overlook land disputes, warriors falsifying honor challenges to seize property, merchants trafficking in goods stolen from human settlements to provoke retaliation. The web went deeper than she'd expected. And when she got too close to naming names, someone had decided she needed to disappear. The ambush had come 3 days ago. 4 warriors, masked and unnamed, had attacked her on the road. She'd killed 2 and wounded a 3rd. But the 4th had gotten a blade between her ribs before she'd escaped into the forest. She'd been running ever since, staying ahead of pursuit, but losing blood with every mile. When she'd finally collapsed beneath that mill foundation, she'd expected to die there. What she hadn't expected was a thin human with kind eyes offering her water. In all her years studying law, presiding over trials, witnessing oaths, she'd learned that the truth of a person showed in crisis. Lies were easy when life was comfortable, but when death was close, people revealed themselves. The human could have walked away, could have killed her while she was weak, could have turned her into his people for whatever reward or safety that might bring. Instead, he'd knelt in the dirt and helped her. That contradiction, human kindness, when she'd expected human hatred, lodged in her chest more painfully than the wound in her shoulder. It made her question things she thought she understood. She'd spent her life believing that truth was absolute, that law was clear, that right and wrong could be determined with study and wisdom. But watching Garrett work to save her life, asking nothing in return, she realized that sometimes truth was simpler than she'd ever imagined. Sometimes it was just one person seeing another person in pain and choosing to help. She woke to the smell of fish broth and the sound of rain on that. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Garrett sat by the fire, stirring a pot with the same careful attention he'd given her wounds. He noticed her watching and asked if she could eat something. She said yes, though her voice came out rougher than intended. He brought her a wooden bowl filled with broth and soft-cooked river greens. It was simple food, nothing like the feast halls of her clan, but it tasted better than anything she'd had in days. She thanked him, and he nodded, sitting back down by the fire. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but careful. Both were aware they were strangers inhabiting a space that should have been impossible. Theora studied him in the firelight. He was smaller than any orc male, lean where her people were broad, but his hands moved with confidence that suggested strength came in forms beyond muscle. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. She asked why he lived alone. He hesitated, then told her about the raids, about his family, about the questions no one would answer. He didn't say it like he wanted pity, just stated it as fact, the way someone might describe weather or geography. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd been trained to listen in court. When he finished, she told him that not all raids during those years had been what they seemed, that she'd heard stories of human bandits using orc weapons to cover their crimes. She didn't approve, but she'd seen enough corruption to know that truth often hid behind convenient lies. His eyes met hers then, sharp with something between hope and pain. He asked if she really believed that. She told him she dealt in evidence and law, and that what she believed mattered less than what could be proven. But yes, she believed it was possible. The conversation shifted after that. He asked about her clan carefully, like he was afraid of giving offense. She told him surface things, that her people valued strength and honor, that they lived by codes older than human kingdoms, that family was everything. She didn't tell him she was chief magistrate, partly because she was still hunted, still in danger, but partly because she wanted him to see her as just a Zara, not as a title or position. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her without calculation or fear. The days fell into rhythm. He checked his nets each morning and brought back whatever the river offered. She helped where she could, mending his torn nets with strong, careful stitches that made him marvel at her precision. He cooked, she cleaned. He told stories about the river. She told stories about the mountains. Neither mentioned the future. One afternoon, he was teaching her a human game with pebbles and lines scratched in the dirt. She kept losing, growing more frustrated each round until finally she swept the pebbles away with a growl that made him laugh. The sound startled both of them. It had been a long time since either had heard genuine laughter. She looked to him, this thin human who'd saved her life and asked nothing in return, and felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction yet, but recognition. Here was someone who understood loneliness. Here was someone who'd lost what mattered and kept going anyway. He caught her looking and asked if she was all right. She said yes, but her voice carried weight. He nodded like he understood things she hadn't said. That night she had nightmares, old ones, about the ambush, about failing her people, about dying alone. She woke gasping and found Garrett sitting nearby, having given up sleep to keep watch. He told her quietly that she cried out, that he wanted to make sure she was safe. She stared at him in the darkness. In her world, weakness was death, showing vulnerability invited challenge. But here, in this small cottage with this strange human, her nightmare had summoned not contempt but care. She asked him why he helped her. He thought about it for a long moment, firelight reflecting in his eyes. Then he told her that after his family died, he'd spent months wanting someone to blame. But blame hadn't brought them back, hadn't made anything better. What had helped finally was realizing that the world had enough cruelty without him adding to it. She told him that in her language there was a word for her that meant someone who chose honor when easier paths were available. She said he was Thrainer and that it was the highest compliment her people could give. He asked what she was. She started to answer with her title, then stopped. Instead, she told him she was someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as just a person. He said he knew that feeling, too. The rain continued outside, and inside 2 people from different worlds sat in comfortable silence, neither quite ready to name what was growing between them. Everything shattered. On the 8th day, Garrett had gone to the village to trade fish for flour. The Zara had argued against it. Too dangerous, too much risk of discovery, but he'd insisted they needed food, and his absence would look more suspicious than his presence. He was walking back along the river path when he saw them. 3 riders coming fast from the north, human soldiers wearing the colors of the regional garrison. They pulled up beside him, and the captain asked if he'd seen any orcs in the area. Garrett's heart kicked against his ribs, but he kept his face blank. He asked why they were looking. The captain said there had been reports of an orc spy near the border, possibly wounded, possibly dangerous. Anyone harboring enemies of the kingdom was guilty of treason. Garrett said he'd seen nothing. He'd been alone by the river for years and preferred it that way. The captain studied him with suspicious eyes, then ordered his men to search the area. Garrett's cottage was the first place they'd look. He ran. By the time he burst through his door, breathless and terrified, Sarah was already on her feet, sword in hand. She'd heard the horses. One look at his face told her everything. She said she would go, that she wouldn't let her be punished for helping her. He said absolutely not, that she was still healing, that they'd kill her on sight. They argued in sharp, desperate whispers until they heard boots on the path outside. Sarah moved behind the door. Garrett opened it before they could break it down. The captain pushed inside with 2 soldiers. They searched the cottage roughly, breaking what little Garrett owned. When they found nothing, the captain turned his attention back to Garrett. Someone in the village had reported seeing him carrying medical supplies, had said he looked nervous. The captain asked again if he was hiding anyone. Garrett said no, said he'd bought supplies for himself, that he'd been ill. His voice stayed steady, though his hands shook. The captain didn't believe him. They arrested him on suspicion of aiding enemies of the crown. One soldier grabbed his arms, while another bound his wrists with rough rope. The captain said they'd take him to the garrison for questioning, that the magistrate would decide his fate. As they dragged him outside, Garrett looked back at his cottage. It was still hidden, still safe. He told himself that was enough. But when the door swung shut behind him, he saw her face in the window gap, stricken, furious, and filled with something that looked terribly like grief. The garrison holding cells were cold stone and iron bars. Garrett sat on the floor, wrists still bound, and tried to think. Aiding the enemy was a hanging offense. The trial would be swift, the sentence swifter. He had no proof of innocence, no witnesses who could help. He thought about the Zara, hoped she'd had sense to run, hoped she'd get back to her people safely. He didn't regret helping her. That was the strange thing. Even now, facing execution, he'd make the same choice. On the 3rd day, they brought him to trial. The courtroom was a large hall in the garrison's administrative building. The regional magistrate sat at the front, a gray-haired man named Aldrich, who'd served for 20 years. The captain presented evidence: Garrett's isolation, his purchase of medical supplies, his nervous behavior, witnessed testimony from villagers who said he'd been acting strained for weeks. It wasn't much, but in times of tension between humans and orcs, it didn't need to be much. Aldrich asked if Garrett had anything to say in his defense. Garrett could have lied, could have crafted some explanation. Instead, he told the truth. He said yes. He'd helped a wounded orc. She'd been dying beneath a mill foundation, and he couldn't walk away. He'd given her shelter and food and medical care. If that made him a traitor, then he was a traitor. But his conscience was clear. The room erupted. The captain called for immediate execution. The magistrate called for order. Garrett stood in the center of it all, strangely calm. At least he'd died knowing he'd done right. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened. She walked in like a storm-given form. The Sarah stood at full height, no longer hunched from injury. She wore clothing she must have retrieved from hiding, formal robes in deep crimson marked with silver clan symbols. Her sword hung at her hip, and on her right hand, the ring was clearly visible. The room went silent. She walked down the center aisle, each step measured and deliberate. When she reached the front, she addressed Magistrate Aldrich in perfect formal language. She said her name was the Zara, that she held the position of Chief Magistrate of the Northern Orc clans, and that she was here to testify in the case of Garrett, fisherman of Mill Bend River. Aldrich stared at her like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He asked if she was truly who she claimed. She showed him the ring, the seal of the orc.